Welcome to part 3 of entomology. In this section, we're going to take a closer look at some beneficial insects that you should be familiar with, and then we're also going to talk about a plan for controlling insects called Integrated Pest Management, or IPM. So hopefully you remember that not all insects are pests. Only about 1% of the insects around the world are technically pests. So many other insects are beneficial. Various insects are very important for pollination, decomposition. They help break down plant matter and dead trees, dead animals in the woods. They're very important for aerating soil. Some insects are very important for biocontrol of weeds and other damaging insects. They provide a very important food source for different animals, fish, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and some insects are actually used for medical uses. So let's start with one that everybody is probably pretty familiar with, the ladybug. You notice the picture of the adult ladybug on the left here, kind of a stereotypical ladybug, orange to red back or elytra, black spots. But are you familiar with what a ladybug larva looks like on the right-hand side here? Many times you may be checking the plants in your garden, and if you see ladybugs, you're going to recognize them right away. But ladybug larvae are just as important because they eat many insect pests also. Some of the different pests that ladybugs will feed on: aphids, mites, scales, mealybugs, thrips, whiteflies, very small caterpillars, some beetle grubs, and then very importantly different insect and mite eggs. Here in Florida we have some native species of ladybugs that look a little bit different from the stereotypical ladybug. All different ladybugs are all in the same family, Coccinellidae, and here you see some pictures of a very common native Florida lady beetle, Skymna species. The adult is on the right, and it's about half the size of a normal ladybug, shaped generally the same, but the immature ladybug on the left-hand side looks very different. Looks a little bit like a mealybug, as a matter of fact. Some of these species feed exclusively on mealybugs, and they're very important natural control of them. Other species feed exclusively on scale insects and really help to keep their numbers under control. Green lacewings, we mentioned in an earlier video. They're members of the order Neuroptera. They're very common in the garden. You see this picture in the upper left-hand side here. That's a very common sight in gardens. Those are green lacewing eggs. Each egg is laid on a separate little stalk. The middle picture here is an immature green lacewing. That's the life form that is going to be a predator. They feed on aphids, insect eggs, scales, mealybugs, and mites. The adult is in the bottom picture. They're very commonly seen around porch lights in the evening here in Florida. Very small, lime green insect flying around. The adults will feed on a little bit of nectar, a little bit of water, but it's the immature form that's the most beneficial. They have a very close relative, the brown lacewing, which looks almost the exact same. It's just a different color. It's brown. The adults are brown instead of bright green. The immatures are going to look a little bit slightly different colored, but they also eat large numbers of aphids, insect eggs, scales, mealybugs, and mites. The eggs for the brown lacewings are not laid on individual little stalks. They're laid in a group, so that's another difference. Another very common and very important predator commonly found in gardens is the flower fly or syrphid fly larva. These larvae, you'll find them on the undersides of leaves, normally feeding on aphids. It looks a little bit like a very tiny, almost see-through caterpillar. What this is the immature form of a fly. You see the picture on the bottom left here. Syrphid flies mimic honeybees. So you might, if you see one on a flower, you might think it's a bee, but it's really a fly. Their larvae feed on large numbers of aphids in the garden. Chances are, if you have a plant with aphids on it, if you look close enough, you're going to find syrphid fly larvae. Syrphid flies are experts at seeking out aphids and laying their eggs nearby. And the adults are also beneficial because they're also very important pollinators too. Big-eyed bugs are very tiny insects that also are very common out in your lawn and in your garden. They're so small that they're only not much larger than a grain of pepper, but they're important because they feed on chinch bug eggs, chinch bugs, moth eggs, caterpillars, thrips, and mites. A lot of times, if you look at a turf sample from a healthy lawn, you're going to find big-eyed bugs in there as a beneficial. Minute pirate bugs are also very tiny insects. They're about the size of a grain of pepper also, but they feed on whiteflies, soakids, leafhoppers, aphids, thrips, mites, and also chinch bugs. Their favorite fruit is thrips, and in fact, if you go out in your yard and find a weed with tiny flowers and look at that flower under a microscope, start digging around, you're probably going to find a couple of flower thrips, and you're going to find a couple of minute pirate bugs chasing them around, feeding on them. These are very important in the garden, also very small, so the kind of thing that most people would never notice. Most stink bugs are plant pests. Keep in mind, stink bugs are in the order Hemiptera, so they have a piercing, sucking mouth part. So most stink bugs feed on plants. They feed on plant leaves, stems, fruits, but there are a few species of predatory stink bugs that are beneficial. These stink bugs, instead of poking their stylet into a plant or into a fruit, catch a small caterpillar, a small beetle, some other kind of pest, poke their mouth part into it, and suck the contents out. Parasitic wasps, or more correctly, parasitoid wasps, are very, very important in the environment. These wasps are very, very tiny, some no bigger than a grain of pepper, and almost every pest insect out in the garden has at least one species of parasitoid wasp that preys on it. What these wasps do is, in the case of many insects like aphids, scales, mealybugs, the female wasp will fly right over the top of the insect, poke into it with its ovipositor, and lay a single egg inside the insect. So the maturing wasp larva will grow and live and mature inside the pest insect it's in. So let's say it's an aphid, and eventually kill the aphid. What happens is the wasp will pupate inside the aphid and eventually cut a little trap door or escape hatch and then fly out of the aphid. Many times, different pests in your garden can be controlled very, very well naturally by just protecting the populations of parasitoid wasps. Other species will land on caterpillars and lay a number of eggs inside of them. So all the maturing wasps will live and feed inside the caterpillar, eventually killing it, then crawling through the skin, making a pupa, and then maturing in the pupa, opening up the pupa and flying off. So in this lower picture here, these little structures that almost look like grains of rice on the back of the caterpillar, what they really are is little wasp pupa or cocoons. So if you ever see a caterpillar like this in your garden, you want to leave it because you want those wasps to finish maturing, fly off, and then each one of them will lay eggs in another caterpillar, and that way they help to keep populations of caterpillars under control. We mentioned earlier that there are certain species of mites that are plant pests in the garden also. The most common one is going to be the two-spotted spider mite, but there are predatory mites out there also that feed on these pest mites, and predatory mites also feed on other mites, thrips, and certain insect eggs. About the only way that you could tell the difference between the two easily is if you turn over a leaf, and if you have spider mites, you'll see them on the underside of the leaf. You're going to need to use a magnifying glass or a microscope to get a good look at them, but they move very, very slowly. The predatory mites or beneficial mites will be running around much faster. They need to be able to run faster to catch their prey and consume them. So, how do we control these insect pests in our lawns and gardens? Even though only 1% of insects are pests, many times we do have problems with them on our plants, in our lawns, We get a lot of questions at Extension about them. The best management technique to follow is something called Integrated Pest Management, or IPM. It's a sustainable approach to managing pests, and this also goes for plant diseases and weeds also, by combining biological, chemical, cultural, and physical controls in a way that minimizes the economic, health, and environmental risks. The main goal is to not kill every pest insect out there, because that's just not practical. That's no matter what you spray or no matter what we do, that's not going to happen. But the goal is to just minimize the number of insects and the levels of insects below where they're actually damaging our plants. So the 5 common practices that are part of all IPM programs. Number one, you need to monitor and scout for pests. This means checking your plants frequently, your lawn, because if you catch problems early, they're much easier to control and correct than if you wait and catch them when it's basically too late to be able to help your plants. Number two is identify pests and or damage correctly. This is probably the most important one, because until you are able to identify exactly what your problem is, exactly what the pest is, there's no way you're going to be able to come up with an effective plan or effective control to change things. Number three, set aesthetic or action thresholds. Basically, have a knowledge and understanding of how many insect pests your plants can handle before they start to show damage. For example, if you go outside and start checking your St. Augustine lawn for chinch bugs, if you find 2 chinch bugs out there, it's not really to the point where you need to spray to control them, because the official action threshold for chinch bugs in a lawn is about 20 chinch bugs per square foot. If you start getting close to this point, you may want to consider a chemical control. If you're well over 20 per square foot, then you may need to take action. But just because you have 1 or 2 or 3 pest insects in your lawn or on your plant does not mean that you have to take action right then and there. Number 4, apply different IPM methods, which we're going to go over. And then number 5, afterwards, you need to evaluate the IPM program. You need to go back to the beginning, monitor again, scout for pests, and find out if what you did, if your plan of action actually worked. Maybe you were incorrect with your identification, maybe the control you used didn't work very well, but you need to go back, evaluate it, and make sure that what you did actually worked to solve the problem. Step number 1 is monitoring. You want to divide the landscape or your vegetable garden or your flower beds or whatever area you're checking into sections, and then at regular intervals you want to go through it and document the following: the pest insects that you actually observed and identified, the locations of those pests, the number of the pests, and then symptoms and signs of pests, how much visible damage has been done to the plants. And then also identify any beneficial insects in the landscape, because when you're considering some kind of control, you need to keep that in mind also. Here's an example of a form that a professional would use if he was working for a, let's say, commercial vegetable grower or commercial landscape nursery. It's an actual sheet where you go through, you mark off the section you checked, what pests you observed, how many of them you observed, the percentage of the plants affected, if you saw any evidence of any of those insects being parasitized by those parasitic wasps we discussed earlier, and then what kind of beneficial insects are present and what type they are. This gives you something actually in writing that you can refer to when you're coming up with making the decision: do I need to spray? Do I need to maybe just keep observing? Am I getting close to a point where I need to spray? This is just a very good way to keep on top of your garden and understand what's going on, what kind of good guys you have living there, what kind of bad guys, how many of each. And this is going to be very important for making your decisions on. Correctly identifying pests is probably the most important thing that you're going to learn how to do. And believe it or not, a lot of homeowners just skip this step right here. Many times they'll see a plant and the plant doesn't look right, doesn't look very healthy, so they assume there must be some kind of insect pest on it. They'll spray it with some kind of insecticide, not really knowing exactly what it's going to do to their plants, and many times they make their problems a lot worse than if they just took a step or two back and actually identify the exact pest or disease or nutrition problem or whatever other kind of problem is actually going on with their plant. So when you're trying to identify the pests, there's a lot of different books, insect keys. I have a lot of insect keys. That's what I use to be able to identify an insect all the way down to either family or genus or species to get an idea of exactly what it is. And then you're also going to look for signs and symptoms. You're going to look for visible evidence of a plant pest or a pathogen. And the symptom is what happens to the plant, the appearance of the plant that's caused by the problem. So it's also very important, if you go back to earlier in the series of videos about plant damage and mouth parts of insects, that's a very important step towards being able to correctly identify the pest. You have to be able to set thresholds or basically decide at what point do I need to take some kind of action to control this insect pest. That's going to be based on the number of insects that you have on your plants. Like I mentioned earlier, if you check a plant and you find 2 or 3 spider mites, that's probably not at the level that you have to take action, but you're going to have to keep on top of it, keep observing, because populations of pest insects can grow very, very quickly. Um, Action thresholds, you're also going to look at what kind of beneficial insects you have present on the plant. Let's say, for example, your plant has several aphids on it, but you see several ladybugs also, and the ladybugs are in the process of eating the aphids. Once again, you may decide to hold off on taking any kind of action right now, but you're going to keep following up on that plant and checking and making sure that those ladybugs continue to do a good job to keep the aphids under control. Otherwise, you may have to change directions and resort to some kind of chemical spray to control them. Cultural controls are basically steps that you can take in advance to try to avoid insect problems or plant diseases or problems with weeds. So a couple steps you could take is starting with healthy plants. I know a lot of times people will like to go to the big box store and buy plants that are reduced off the reduced rack. They're marked down to 50 cents or a dollar. They figure I could take them home and nurse them back to health. Many times those plants have diseases and insects that if you buy them and bring them home, you're going to introduce them to all the rest of your plants in your garden. So you always want to start with healthy plants, prepare the planting area properly, keep your plants and turf grass healthy. Some different ways that you could do that is by using the proper type and amount of fertilizer. Too much fertilizer is bad for plants, makes them grow too fast, too lush, and many times will attract insects. And water properly. Too little water and your plants become stressed and more prone to insect and disease damage. And if you water too much, your plants can also become stressed from too much water. A lot of times what makes your plant very attractive to an insect pest or a disease is the level of stress. So taking steps to help reduce the amount of stress on your plants goes a long way towards avoiding insect and disease problems. Using mulch, of course, helps to block weeds, reduce the number of weeds, helps to hold the moisture in the soil. It also helps to reduce soil splash. Growing your plants in a garden with bare soil, if we have a heavy rain, that soil is going to splash back up on the leaves, and many times the soil will contain fungal spores and bacteria that can spread plant disease to your plants. We'll cover that a lot more when we go through plant pathology. Keep landscapes clean. If you have disease parts of bushes and plants and you trim those plants and you leave those branches, debris, and fallen leaves behind, a lot of times they're covered with fungal spores. So those fungal spores are going to stay in your garden, they're going to spread to healthy plants and healthy leaves, and you're only going to compound your disease problems. So clean up the fallen leaves, clean up the diseased plant parts, go ahead and trim them off and remove them from your landscape. And then you need to learn how to tolerate a few pests and a little bit of damage. Certain plants are very difficult to grow in Central Florida without any insect damage at all. Other plants tend to either have very few insect problems or tolerate it very well. A lot of times native plants are, they have developed along with the insects and they tolerate insects very well. So even if you do have insects feeding on them, it's not going to damage them very badly. So you have to think about exactly how many insect pests and how much damage that you could tolerate. Biological control is using all those nice beneficial insects we just got done covering in your garden to do the work for you. They're more than happy to parasitize caterpillars, eat stink bugs, eat the aphids, the mealybugs, everything else that's bothering your plants. Now, there's three different types of biological control that you should be familiar with. The one that homeowners are going to use in the yard is called conservation biological control. This is basically taking steps to try to encourage and preserve the beneficial insects that you have naturally on your property to stay there, to reproduce successfully, to breed, to be happy and healthy and stay in your yard and keep doing their work. Classical biological control has to do with invasive insects and plants. What happens is researchers will go to the country that that plant or insect came from and try to find what keeps it under control in its native range. Sometimes they may find a beneficial insect that they can bring back to the United States. It's put through several years worth of testing to make sure it's not going to feed on other insects, feed on other plants, become an even bigger problem than the original invasive insect. And if it's safe, scientists, USDA, and Extension Service will all help to release these insects to help keep the pest invasive insects under control. And then inoculative biological control is something that greenhouse growers commonly use. That's where they actually order beneficial insects that have been raised in a lab and they release them inside their greenhouses to help knock down populations of pest insects. We don't normally recommend for homeowners to order beneficial insects and release them. That's really difficult to do on an outdoor situation. I know that different stores, and if you look online, you can actually buy ladybugs. Problem is, if you release them in your garden, they frequently fly away right away. So a much better plan is to just have the kind of garden, keep the pesticide use at a minimum, keep the broad spectrum pesticide use at a bare minimum, and try to encourage the native ladybugs and beneficial insects we already have here. Physical control means just what it sounds like, using physical control steps to help reduce problems with insects and weeds. So this can be anything from removing pest insects by hand. Sometimes you may have a pest insect and you only have a few of them. Let's say lubber grasshoppers, caterpillars on a plant, caterpillars on your tomato plants. And instead of going and mixing up some kind of pesticide, spraying your entire garden, sometimes it's just easier to pick them off by hand and throw them in a bucket of either soapy water or alcohol to kill them. Some people will squish insects. I know that's not for everybody, but that is a very effective non-chemical physical control. Removing infested parts. If you have one branch tip on your plant, maybe just trimming that off and disposing of it is going to eliminate your insect problems. And then establishing some kind of barriers to prevent pest access to plants. Some people will use screening over their gardens. If you grow plants in a lanai, inside of a hoop house or a shade house, sometimes that will help to actually physically prevent the insect pests from getting inside and attacking your plants. Now, I hope you notice that chemical control is the last step that you want to make use of. We don't discourage chemical control, but we don't tell people to start with it either. A lot of times, there's other more important steps that you need to take first: proper identification, cultural controls, trying to avoid the pests, but sometimes pest problems are unavoidable and you're going to have to resort to chemical controls. So what you want to do is choose or recommend the least toxic product that will effectively manage the pest. You don't want to start with the strongest thing in your shed. You want to start with the least toxic product that's going to be appropriate for the pests that you've identified and actually be effective at controlling it. So you want to use selective chemicals rather than broad spectrum. Things like if you have a problem with caterpillars, use Bacillus thuringiensis. We're going to discuss that a little bit more. Nowadays on the market there are a lot of selective chemicals. It's not like it was 10, 20 years ago where your only options were very broad spectrum things that would kill all the insects, the lizards, the toads, basically everything in your garden. There's a lot of much better choices nowadays. Timing is very important. You want to only go out there and treat with a chemical control when the pest is in a life stage that is easy to control. For example, a really good example is lubber grasshoppers. Lubber grasshoppers emerge in the early spring, usually in March. They're very small. They have a very thin cuticle, very easy to control at that point. As a matter of fact, they're gregarious, which means they stick together in large groups when they're young. As the summer goes on, they become larger, and by August and September, they are very, very large. They have a very, very thick cuticle, and basically, there's no chemical that's going to be effective on controlling them. They're no longer gregarious, which means they're scattered all over your yard. So to go out there and spray a broad spectrum insecticide over your entire yard is probably not going to be the best choice, because number one, you have to actually hit each grasshopper with the spray to kill it. That's probably not going to happen. Number two, you only might have 10, 20, even 50 scattered amongst your entire yard. No point spraying everything in your yard just to control a couple grasshoppers. So you always want to be aware of what life stage the pest is at right now, and is that the right life stage to be using a chemical control. You want to spot treat where insects are abundant. If you do have insects in one corner of your yard, one area, one little spot in your lawn where you've identified you have a high number of chinch bugs, you want to just spot spray in those areas instead of hosing down your entire property. And then you always want to try to combine chemical controls with other methods to take, instead of just a one-step approach, a multi-step approach to control these problems and get much better control. When it comes to properly using pesticides, we have a whole nother presentation coming up just on pesticide safety and how to use them properly. But you always want to utilize the University of Florida recommendations when making chemical recommendations to the public. And of course, always follow all label directions. Technically, it's the law. We have a little saying that the label is the law. So you always want to follow all the label directions and recommend to your clients to do the same. Many times they may grab a pesticide off the shelf. It might be labeled for the insect pests they have. Maybe they think it's going to do a fine job. But if you read the label, if there's information about what kind of plants it cannot be used safely on, it's going to be there. So I've talked to a lot of people who didn't read the label, and they were very, very sorry afterwards that they didn't. So let's just leave it at make sure that you read the label thoroughly and follow all the directions. Here's a little diagram that shows a whole bunch of different beneficial insects that we've already covered, both the adult form and the immature form, or maybe the eggs also. So we're going to go over this diagram live in person in class. As a matter of fact, I think we're going to turn it into a little bit of a contest and give out prizes for whoever's able to give the best answers. So go ahead and look this over, study hard, become familiar with different common beneficial insects, both the adults and the immatures, because many times they look very, very different. And I believe that's all we have for right now on entomology. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Write your questions down, ask them in class. Chances are, if I'm not clear on something, you have a question about it, other people are wondering the same thing. So this is a picture here of a milkweed plant, and the little orange insects are aphids. They're oleander aphids, very, very common insect pest on milkweed plants. But the little green, almost caterpillar-looking organisms in the very center of your picture here is a syrphid fly larva. Like I said earlier when we were talking about syrphid flies, if you look closely at a milkweed or any other plant that has a lot of aphids on it, you're bound to find a number of other insects there that are busy eating the aphids. So you don't have to look very long and hard to find these different insects. When I say they're common in the garden, they really are. You just have to go out there and look closely for them. So like I said, once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.